During the next several days, Mrs. Prim and Lyle found themselves running into Clover Sue Hipple almost everywhere they went. At the supermarket, they discovered her peeking out from behind a huge display of cornflakes. Another time, they caught a glimpse of her hiding behind a tree. And again, one afternoon, they discovered her crouched behind a mailbox. Each time, Mrs. Prim smiled and tried to say hello, and each time Clover skittered off before she had a chance. One day, as she was about to leave the house, Mrs. Prim glanced down just in time to see another note wiggle its way into the house. Quickly she opened the door. Before her, wide-eyed with surprise, and still clutching the note, stood Clover Sue Hipple. "Clover, dear, please don't run away," cried Mrs. Prim. "I would like to speak with you about Lyle." "Has Lyle done something to make you angry with him?" "He takes my friends away from me," Clover burst out. "He what?" "He takes away. They run to play with him, and they play with him all of the time. I never have fun when Lyle is around." "But why can't you play with Lyle, too?" asked Mrs. Prim. "Because," answered Clover. "Because of what?" "Because I'm not allowed. My mother says I'm not allowed to play with crocodiles." "Why don't you invite Clover's mother over here to meet Lyle?" suggested Mr. Prim that night. "I'm sure when she sees for herself how gentle Lyle really is, she won't mind if Clover plays with him." Mrs. Prim telephoned Clover's mother the very next day. "Lyle and I wanted so much to meet you," she said. "Could you join us for tea tomorrow afternoon?" "I would be delighted," answered Mrs. Hipple. Mrs. Hipple made a note of the address, and all was cheerfully arranged. Now, who is this nice Mrs. Prim? Clover's mother wondered. Setting up the new house had left her a little time for meeting neighbors. And who is Lyle? The only Lyle she knew of was that wretched Lyle the crocodile creature who lived with a most peculiar family somewhere nearby. Imagine, she chuckled disapprovingly, a crocodile living among decent, respectable people. But this Lyle, he must be that nice Mrs. Prim's husband, she decided. Of course. Beep. "Remember now, Lyle," said Mrs. Prim the following afternoon, "when Mrs. Hipple arrives, greet her with your very best manners. Offer to take her coat, and when you have hung it neatly in the closet, join us in the living room. Understand?" Lyle nodded. "Good," said Mrs. Prim, humming as she returned to the kitchen. When Mrs. Hipple arrived, Lyle started down the stairs to meet her, but then he stopped. "Suppose she won't like me," the thought popped into his head. Suddenly a wave of shyness came over Lyle. Suddenly the last thing in the world he wanted to do was to meet Mrs. Hipple. "Lyle, Lyle!" called Mrs. Prim. Beep. "Lyle, Lyle, where are you? We have company." Mrs. Prim called again as she led her guest into the living room. He wanted to go to her, but instead, and although he kept telling himself it was absolutely the silliest, most ridiculous thing he could possibly do, Lyle squeezed himself into the hall closet and hid. Mrs. Prim looked for him upstairs, and she looked for him downstairs. "I just can't imagine what has become of Lyle," he heard her exclaim. Amid the tinkling of teacups, Lyle could hear the voices of the two women. They talked about this, that, and everything under the sun. It was so stuffy and uncomfortable in the closet he began to wish they would talk about Mrs. Hipple leaving. At long last Lyle heard Mrs. Hipple say, "I must be going now," and Mrs. Prim say, "I'm so glad you came, and so sorry you missed Lyle, but I do hope you will be meeting him real soon." Then Lyle heard the handle of the closet door turn, and Mrs. Prim said, "Here, let me get your coat."
Beep.
The instant the door opened, Lyle fell out upon both women. Mrs. Prim let out a sharp gasp, and Mrs. Hipple definitely screamed. "Are you all right? Are you all right?" Mrs. Prim cried out as they struggled to their feet. "Take him away! Take that monster away from me!" Mrs. Hipple began to shriek. "Oh, please, he won't hurt you. I promise he won't hurt you." Mrs. Prim tried to reassure her. "Look at him. He's more frightened than you are." "Let me out of here," Mrs. Hipple shrieked on. "Let me out of this terrible house."
Beep.
Mrs. Prim opened the door as Mrs. Hipple, her hair and clothes all in a rumple, stumbled from the house. "If that crocodile ever so much as crosses my path, I'll have him arrested," she called back over her shoulder. "This is supposed to be a nice neighborhood, you know." "Poor Lyle," sighed Mrs. Prim that night. "Now he's afraid he's going to be arrested. We're just going to have to think of something to take his mind off his troubles."
Beep.
On the first warm day, Prims knew just what to do for Lyle. "We'll take him to the beach," they decided. "Swimming has always been Lyle's favorite sport," smiled Mrs. Prim. "And he's by far the best swimmer in the family," her husband added. While Mr. and Mrs. Prim made themselves comfortable and Joshua started on a sand castle, Lyle took a running dive into the water.
Beep.
Lyle's water stunts delighted everyone close by. He really does like to swim, doesn't he? Look at him doing turns and flips. Reminds me of Candace and Jessica and Chelsea in the summer in the swimming pool, huh?
Beep.
Everyone, that is, except Mrs. Hipple, who had just arrived, and with Clover was dunking her feet. Mrs. Hipple set out at once to find a lifeguard. "Lifeguard! Lifeguard!" she cried. "Do you permit crocodiles to bathe here?" "Certainly not," answered the lifeguard. "Well, it might interest you to know that there is a crocodile bathing out there this very minute." Mrs. Hipple pointed to the spot where she had seen the crocodile.
Beep.
Suddenly, everybody on the beach was looking and pointing, but not at a crocodile. They were pointing to a little girl thrashing about helplessly in the water. "Clover! Clover!" cried Mrs. Hipple. "She's drowning!" The lifeguard immediately pushed off to the rescue, but Lyle raced to the scene before them. "There's a crocodile out there," someone gasped. "No, it's Lyle," called Mrs. Prim, standing nearby. "I mean, it's Lyle the crocodile."
Beep.
Lyle brought a very wet but happy Clover safely back to shore. "Hurrah for Lyle!" the crowd shouted. "Oh, Lyle, dear friend," sobbed Mrs. Hipple. "How can I ever thank you enough?" Everyone was so proud of Lyle. He was immediately appointed honorary lifeguard, and he was then given a hat, a sweatshirt, and a silver whistle. "Lyle, you are a hero," said the head lifeguard. "Feel free to come here and save people from drowning any time you choose."
Beep.
The next day, a note addressed to Lyle was found under the door of the house on East 88th Street. "Oh, no, not again," Mrs. Prim moaned. "Dear Lyle," read Mr. Prim, "I love you. I love you more than anything. I love you so much I can't stand it." And the note was signed, "Your friend for life, Clover Sue Hipple." "P.S." Mr. Prim continued, "May I play with you today? P.P.S. My mother said it's all right." Lyle smiled, one of his big, big smiles. Oh, that made him happy, didn't it? "All right, Caitlin.